Today we're going to be talking a little bit about World War II and life on the home front. Life on the home front means life for American citizens who were back home and not fighting in the war. This is a quote from President Franklin Roosevelt, who was president during the time of World War II. He said, "We are now in this war. We are all in it, all the way. Every single man, woman, and child is a partner in the most tremendous undertaking of our American history." So not only were the military involved in the war, but people back home had to help out too. And we're about to talk about how they did that. One of the first things that they did, they had a lot of pride in their nation, right? Um, and one of the things they did was they hung service flags. And these would signify that a family member was serving in the armed forces. Sometimes on the flags you would see a blue star, which means that somebody was actively serving in the military. Sometimes you would see a gold star, which was sewn above the blue star, which meant that a family member died while in the course of service. And sometimes you would see a silver star on the flag, which meant that a family member was in the military and they were either wounded or injured in the battle. So every family that had somebody in the military would display this, usually in the front window of their home facing the street. And that showed pride in their country. Another thing that American citizens did was they paid war bonds. War bonds were a loan that American citizens would give to the government to fund the war. They would give the government money so that the government could afford the war, with hopes that they would get that money back in the future with interest, which means they would get a little more than what they gave the government. And their money helped support those in the military who were fighting the war. During this time, there's also an industrial transformation, which means that a lot of the factories changed their focus from consumer goods to war materials. So instead of making things for people at home, they were making things for people at war, whether they were making airplanes or transportation for people in the war, or they were making weapons. Ordinary factories for people at home would become factories that would support the military. For example, General Motors, instead of they started making airplane engines and guns and trucks and tanks, and these are not things that they would normally make. So people at home had less resources from what they would usually buy, but people in the military had what they needed to fight the war. There were also scrap drives during this time. Every little bit was needed to help fund the war effort. They used every little bit of scrap metal and paper that was recycled to help with things in the military. For example, scrap metal that people would donate could help build ships or tanks or planes or weapons. Newspapers and paper could be used for things like military correspondence or packaging for the military. Even cooking grease, who knew, was collected by butchers and could make explosives. Did you ever think that the stuff that comes out of your bacon could make explosives? Pretty cool. Another thing that happened during this time was rationing. So what that means is that everybody could only get a certain amount of different foods and materials that they need, because a lot of those materials were needed for the military, right? So one of the things that they rationed was metals, so that those metals could be used in making supplies for the military, like airplanes and things like that. So people couldn't buy cars or bikes during this time. A lot of the food was rationed, so people could only get a certain amount of sugar or meat or milk, because that food needed to go to the military. There are also rationings of gas and clothing and shoes. Another thing that was rational we talked about was gas. So you could only get so much gas every now and then. You couldn't just go to the gas station and fill up whenever you wanted to, like we can now. So the general public only got 3 gallons of gas per week. Other people got a little bit more gas, like if you owned a business, you get 8 gallons per week so that you can transport your goods. But most people only got a little bit of gas every week. And the rest of that gas went to the war effort in the military. The roles of women also had to change during this time. Prior to the war, a lot of women didn't work. They stayed home. They were housewives. Their job was to stay home and to raise the children, which is not how it is today, but that was their view back then. And when all the men left to go fight in the war, the jobs of women had to change as well. Now, some women could be involved in some of the armed services, like the Women's Air Corps, volunteer emergency service with the Navy, Air Force service pilots. They could do some things in the war, and they could also get involved by being nurses or doing other jobs. But a lot of women at home had to work. They started doing jobs that the men used to do, like working in factories. One of the icons that you might see, which is in the bottom right corner, is Rosie the Riveter. She was a figure based on a real woman, who is a woman who had been a housewife that started working in the factories as a result of the war. Because when all the men left, there was nobody to work in the factory, so the women had to do it. And she's shown as really strong for taking that job. We can see here some more depictions of Rosie the Riveter type women. Again, depicted as very strong ladies. They're taking over the nation while the men are gone, right? So they have to be strong. Another thing that people back home did was they made victory gardens. And basically what this meant is that they grew their own food at home. So because of rationing, you couldn't just go to the grocery store and get whatever food you wanted. Your food was limited, so you had to grow your own food if you wanted to feed your family well. So a lot of people did this to support the war effort so that they wouldn't have to go buy food. That food could be used for the military. And even people who didn't have big backyards could do this. People did like garden boxes in their windows if they lived in the city, for example. That's one way they supported the war. Another way that they were involved in the war, so they had something called victory mail or V-mail. Normally you would be able to write a letter to a loved one that was fighting overseas. Back in the day, they didn't have anything like phone calls or FaceTime. To talk to their loved ones, they had to write letters. So these letters would be written down on a piece of paper, and then they would be censored by the government to make sure that nobody disclosed any information that would make them lose the war. They won't want to have information in there that somebody on the opposite side of the war could get to get in the way of what they're planning, right? So it would be censored. And then that mail would be put in a film and then shipped overseas instead of sending the actual letter, because it was less expensive and it was easier to send a small roll of film with a bunch of letters on it and then print it once they got there instead of sending an actual letter. So what people would receive once they got a mail from, let's say, a soldier overseas, they would receive a picture of the letter that was actually written because it was the picture that was on the film, right? So that was kind of a cool way of sending mail that was a little different during that time. Overall, during World War II, the themes on the home front were service, sacrifice, flexibility, and collaboration and teamwork. People worked together and took on new positions and did things they weren't used to doing. to support one another and also to support the war effort, to support the American military overseas and the other allies that were fighting against the Axis powers. And this cooperation of everybody on the home front back home is part of why we were able to win the war.